Have you ever had the quiet feeling that something important slipped past you? Not because you weren't paying attention. Not because you didn't try hard enough. But because no one ever showed you where to look. And so you kept searching. In books. In people. In endless explanations. Hoping that one day, something would finally click. But it never fully did it? There were moments, yes. Moments where everything felt like it made sense. Like you were this close to understanding how life really works. And then, it faded. Why does that happen? Why does clarity come, only to disappear again? Why does it feel like you're always circling around something, but never quite reaching it? What if the problem was never complexity? What if it was never about learning more? Or trying harder? What if it was about something so simple that it was easy to overlook? Think about that for a moment. How many times have you been told to stay positive? To believe more? To repeat the right words? And yet, deep down, something didn't change. You said the words. You followed the steps. You did what you were told. But the results? They felt inconsistent, unpredictable, almost out of your control. And that creates a very specific kind of frustration. Not loud frustration. Not obvious. But a quiet one. The kind that makes you wonder. Am I missing something? Because it shouldn't feel this complicated. If something is truly a law, if it truly works the same way every time, then why does it feel like it works for some people, but not for you? That question alone has kept people searching for years. And maybe you've been asking it too. But here's the part no one really talks about. Sometimes, the thing you're searching for is not hidden because it's complicated. It's hidden because it was never explained. In the way your mind could actually understand. And once you see it, really see it, you don't go back to confusion again. Because suddenly, everything that didn't make sense before starts to connect. And you realize it was never far from you. Not even for a second. There is nothing wrong with you. Not with the way you think. Not with the way you feel. Not even with the way you've been trying. If anything, the reason you're here, still searching, still questioning, still open, is because something inside you knows there's more. Something deeper. Something that hasn't been fully explained yet. And that matters. Because most people don't even reach that point. They either give up, or they settle for partial answers that never truly satisfy them. But you didn't. Still, it's important to understand this clearly. The confusion you felt up until now, it was never your fault. You were simply taught to approach life in a way that creates resistance without you even realizing it. From a very early age, you were shown that effort equals results. That if you want something, you have to chase it. Push harder. Try more. Think more. Do more. And on the surface, that seems logical. But when it comes to how life actually responds to you, that approach quietly works against you. Because no one ever explained the difference between action and alignment. So you did what anyone would do. You tried to fix things. You tried to improve yourself. You tried to control outcomes. And when things didn't change the way you expected, you didn't blame the method. You blamed yourself. You thought maybe you weren't disciplined enough. Or focused enough. Or positive enough. But that wasn't true. The real issue is much more subtle than that. You were taught to use your conscious mind for everything. While the part of you that actually shapes your reality was left completely untrained. No one told you how your deeper mind works. No one showed you how it responds. No one explained why sometimes you say the right things, but still feel the opposite inside. And that gap creates frustration. Because on one level, you're doing everything right. But on another level, nothing feels stable. It's like trying to steer a car from the passenger seat. You can see where you want to go. You can even describe it perfectly. But you're not the one controlling the direction. And over time, that creates doubt. Not loud doubt, but quiet, persistent doubt. The kind that whispers, maybe this just doesn't work for me. But that thought itself is a result of misunderstanding, not truth. Because the principles that shape reality don't pick and choose. They don't work for some people and ignore others. They are consistent. The only difference is how they are applied. And most people were never shown the correct way. Instead, they were given surface-level ideas. Fragments of truth. Just think positive. Repeat this affirmation. Visualize what you want. And while those things can have value, without the right understanding behind them, they often feel empty. Like you're going through the motions, hoping something will happen. But hoping isn't the same as knowing. And that's where the disconnect begins. You start to feel like you're doing everything you can. But something invisible is still holding things in place. That invisible layer is what was never properly explained. And again, this is not your fault. You didn't create this confusion. You inherited it from a system that focuses on external action, but rarely teaches internal alignment. From advice that sounds good on the surface, but lacks depth when you try to apply it consistently. And from a world that rewards effort, but doesn't always explain how results are actually formed. So if you've ever felt tired of trying, if you've ever questioned whether something was missing, if you've ever sensed that there had to be a simpler, more direct way, you were right. That feeling wasn't weakness. It was awareness. A quiet recognition that something about the way you were taught to approach life was incomplete. And now, you're beginning to see that. Not all at once. Not with overwhelming clarity. But slowly. Piece by piece. The pressure starts to lift. Because instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" you begin to ask a different question. What was I never shown? And that question changes everything. Because it shifts your focus away from self-blame and toward understanding. And once that shift happens, you stop forcing. You stop overcorrecting. You stop trying to become something you were never meant to be. And instead, you become curious. Curious about how things actually work. Curious about what's been overlooked. Curious about what might happen if you approached everything differently. Not with more effort. Not with more pressure. But with a deeper awareness. And that's where things begin to open. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But in a way that feels real. Because for the first time, you're not trying to fix yourself. You're starting to understand yourself. Most people never realize this. Because on the surface, everything they're doing looks right. They're trying. They're learning. They're applying what they've been taught. And yet, the results don't match the effort. So they assume one of two things. Either they need to do more, or something is wrong with them. But what if neither of those is true? What if the real issue isn't how much you're doing, but how you're doing it? Because there's a pattern most people fall into. And it's so subtle, it feels completely normal. They try to change their life from the same internal state that created the problem in the first place. Think about that. When something feels uncertain, what do most people do? They start thinking more. Analyzing more. Trying to figure everything out. They look for answers. They replay situations. They try to predict outcomes. And in doing that, they unknowingly reinforce the very state they're trying to escape. Because all of that effort is coming from one place. Doubt. Not obvious doubt. Not the kind you openly admit, but a quiet, underlying uncertainty that says, I need to fix this, because something isn't right. And that feeling becomes the foundation of every action that follows. So even when you say the right words, or repeat the correct affirmations, or visualize the outcome you want, there's still a deeper signal underneath it all. A signal that says, I don't have this yet. And that's the part most people miss. They focus on the surface. The words, the techniques, the actions. But they ignore the state those actions are coming from. And that state is what actually shapes the result. This is why effort alone can feel so frustrating. Because you can be doing everything right on the outside, while unintentionally working against yourself on the inside. For example, someone wants financial stability. So they think about money constantly. They plan. They worry. They calculate. They repeat affirmations like, I am wealthy. But underneath all of that, there's tension. There's urgency. There's fear of not having enough. And that emotional state doesn't match the outcome they're trying to create. So instead of moving forward, they feel stuck. Or they experience small, temporary progress, followed by setbacks that bring them right back to where they started. And it feels confusing. Because logically, it doesn't make sense. They're doing the work. They're putting in the effort. So why isn't it consistent? The same thing happens in relationships. Someone wants love, connection, closeness. So they try harder. They give more attention. They think about the other person constantly. They try to say the right things. But underneath, there's a fear of losing. A need for validation. A subtle sense of I hope this works. And that energy, that internal state, creates pressure. Not visible pressure, but something that can be felt. And over time, it pushes things away. Again, not because the desire is wrong, but because the state behind it is misaligned. This is where most people get trapped. They believe that more effort will fix the problem. So when things don't work, they double down. More thinking. More affirmations. More trying. But all that does is strengthen the same internal state. It's like trying to calm water by stirring it faster. The intention is good, but the method creates the opposite effect. And because this pattern feels productive, it's rarely questioned. No one tells you to stop trying so hard. No one explains that effort, in this context, can actually create resistance. So you continue, not realizing that the very thing you believe will bring change is what's holding things in place. And this is where the shift begins. Not by adding something new, but by seeing what doesn't work. Because once you truly understand this pattern, once you recognize how often your actions are driven by subtle doubt, you start to pause. You start to notice. You begin to see the difference between acting from certainty and reacting from uncertainty. And that awareness alone changes something. You're no longer blindly repeating behaviors. You're observing them. And in that observation, a new possibility opens. Because if the problem was never about doing more, then maybe the answer isn't about doing more either. Maybe it's about something deeper. Something quieter. Something that has nothing to do with force. And everything to do with alignment. But that's the part most people never reach. Because they're too busy trying to fix the surface. To look beneath it. And yet, everything you've been experiencing up until now, the inconsistency, the frustration, the feeling of almost understanding, it all points to one thing. You've been focusing on the visible actions, while the invisible foundation was shaping everything. And once you begin to see that clearly, you can't unsee it. Because suddenly, the pattern becomes obvious. Not just in your life, but in everything around you. There is a principle at work here. Whether you're aware of it or not. It doesn't depend on your effort. It doesn't respond to how badly you want something. And it certainly doesn't change based on how many times you repeat the right words. It operates in a much quieter, but far more precise way. This is the part that thinkers like Joseph Murphy try to explain. Not as a theory. Not as motivation. But as a law. A consistent, predictable process that shapes your external reality based on something internal, something deeper than surface thought. Because what most people call thinking is only happening at the conscious level. It's the voice in your head. The words you choose. The ideas you repeat. But beneath that, there is another layer. A layer that doesn't argue. Doesn't analyze. Doesn't question. It simply accepts and reflects. This is the part of you that doesn't respond to what you say. It responds to what you feel is true. And that distinction changes everything. Because you can say one thing and feel something completely different. You can say, everything is working out, while internally feeling uncertain. You can repeat, I am confident, while still carrying doubt beneath the surface. And in those moments, it's not the words that matter. It's the internal state behind them. That's what this principle is built on. The idea that your deeper mind, your subconscious, does not interpret language the way your conscious mind does. It interprets impressions, feelings, assumptions, certainty. Whatever feels real to you becomes real to it. And once something is accepted at that level, it begins to express itself outwardly. Not instantly. Not always in obvious ways. But consistently. This is why two people can do the exact same thing and experience completely different results. One person speaks from a place of quiet certainty. The other speaks from hope mixed with doubt. On the surface, their actions look identical. But internally, they're not. And that internal difference is what shapes the outcome. This is the hidden law most people overlook. Because it's not dramatic. It doesn't involve complex techniques. It doesn't require endless repetition. In fact, it often works best when there's less effort involved. Which is why it's so easy to miss. Because everything you've been taught points in the opposite direction. More effort. More control. More repetition. But this principle suggests something very different. That life doesn't respond to force. It responds to alignment. Alignment between what you consciously say and what you subconsciously accept as true. And when those two are in conflict, the deeper level always wins. Not because it's stronger in a physical sense, but because it's the part of you that actually directs behavior, perception, and reaction. It filters how you see the world. It influences how you respond to situations. It even affects the opportunities you notice or ignore. So when there's a mismatch, when you're trying to create one outcome while internally expecting another, you experience resistance. Not because something is blocking you, but because your internal signals are inconsistent. And life reflects that inconsistency back to you. Sometimes as delays. Sometimes as mixed results. Sometimes as complete stagnation. But always in a way that mirrors the internal state. This is why simply trying harder rarely solves the problem. Because effort doesn't change the underlying impression. You can repeat something 1,000 times. But if it doesn't feel real, it doesn't register at the level that matters. And that's where most people get stuck. They treat the subconscious like something they can convince with logic. When in reality, it doesn't respond to logic at all. It responds to experience. To what feels natural. To what feels familiar. To what feels certain. That's why beliefs formed early in life can feel so persistent. Not because they're true, but because they were accepted without resistance. They felt real at the time. And so they became internalized. And unless something shifts at that level, they continue to influence everything that follows. Quietly. Automatically. But here's the important part. This isn't something you're stuck with. Because the same principle that created those patterns is the one that can change them. Not through force. Not through pressure. But through understanding. Through recognizing that the goal is not to control every thought, but to shift the internal state those thoughts come from. And that shift doesn't happen by accident. It happens when you begin to see this law clearly. When you understand that your role is not to make things happen, but to align with a state where they naturally unfold. That idea alone can feel unfamiliar at first, because it challenges everything you've been taught about effort and control. But once it starts to make sense, something begins to settle. You stop trying to overpower your reality. You start paying attention to what you're internally accepting is true. And that awareness is where the real change begins. Because now, you're not just reacting to life. You're starting to understand the mechanism behind it. And once you understand the mechanism, you're no longer guessing. You're no longer relying on scattered techniques. You're seeing the pattern for what it is. A consistent reflection of something deeper. And that realization brings you closer to the one piece that most people never fully grasp. The part that ties everything together. The part that was always there, but rarely explained in a way that could truly be understood. So what was it? What was the one thing, hidden in plain sight, that so many people overlooked? It wasn't a technique. It wasn't a special method. And it wasn't something complicated that required years to master. In fact, it was the opposite. It was something so simple that most people dismissed it. This is the part of the message that almost everyone heard, but very few actually understood. The secret was never in the words. It was never in repeating affirmations perfectly. It was never in visualizing harder. It was never in forcing belief through effort. The secret was in certainty. Not surface-level confidence. Not temporary motivation. But a quiet, internal knowing. That doesn't argue, doesn't question, and doesn't look for proof. This is what Joseph Murphy was pointing toward, again and again. That your subconscious mind does not respond to what you want. It responds to what you accept as already true. And that changes everything. Because most people are trying to create something from a state of not having it. They say the words, but inside, they're waiting. Waiting for a sign. Waiting for confirmation. Waiting for something external to prove that it's working. And that waiting is the signal. It tells the deeper mind, this is not real yet. So no matter how many times the words are repeated, the underlying message remains the same. I don't have this. And the result reflects that. This is why things feel inconsistent. Not because the principle isn't working, but because the state behind it keeps shifting. One moment, you feel hopeful. The next, uncertain. One moment, you believe. The next, you question. And that fluctuation creates mixed outcomes. But when certainty is present, everything stabilizes. Because certainty doesn't fluctuate. It doesn't depend on circumstances. It doesn't look outside for validation. It simply is. Think about something you already know to be true. Not something you hope for, but something you're absolutely certain about. You don't repeat it to convince yourself. You don't visualize it to make it real. You don't check for signs to confirm it. You just know. And because you know, you move differently. You think differently. You respond differently. There's no tension. No urgency. No need to force anything. That's the state. And that's the part most people missed. They tried to do the right things, without becoming the person who naturally thinks and feels from that place. They focused on techniques, instead of identity. They tried to create results, without first creating the internal certainty those results come from. And that's why it felt like something was always missing. Because the foundation wasn't there. You can build as much as you want on the surface. But if the base is unstable, nothing holds. So the real shift is not in what you do. It's in what you accept. What you stop questioning. What you stop waiting for. What you internally decide is already settled. Because once something feels settled, your entire system aligns with it. You stop overthinking. You stop checking. You stop reacting to every small change. And in that stillness, things begin to move. Not because you forced them, but because you're no longer resisting them. This is why sometimes a single moment of true certainty can do more than weeks of effort. Because in that moment, there's no contradiction, no mixed signals, no internal conflict, just alignment. And alignment is what allows the principle to work clearly. This is the message that was always there. Not hidden in complexity, but hidden in simplicity. And because it seemed too simple, it was often overlooked. People kept searching for something more advanced, something more powerful, something that felt like it required effort. But the truth is, the more natural something feels, the more effective it becomes. And certainty, when it's real, feels natural. It doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel like work. It feels like something you've already accepted. So instead of asking, how do I make this happen? The question becomes, what would it feel like if this were already certain? Not hoped for. Not imagined. But certain. Because the moment you touch that state, even briefly, you understand something. You understand that nothing outside of you needed to change first. The shift was always internal. And once that internal shift happens, everything else begins to follow. Not instantly. Not dramatically. But in a way that feels steady. Predictable. Real. Because now, you're no longer trying to create from uncertainty. You're operating from something much deeper. Something that doesn't need to be repeated. Or proven. Or forced. Something that simply holds. And that is the part most people missed. It's one thing to understand an idea. It's another to see how it actually plays out in real life. Because this isn't about theory. It's not about abstract concepts that sound good, but don't translate into reality. This principle shows up in the smallest shifts. And creates the biggest changes. Not because something magical happens. But because the internal state changes first. And once that changes, everything else begins to reorganize around it. Let's look at what that actually means. There was someone who had been struggling in a relationship for months. Nothing dramatic. No major conflict. But something felt off. The communication was inconsistent. The energy felt uncertain. And no matter what they tried, it didn't stabilize. So they did what most people do. They tried to fix it. They thought more about what to say. They analyzed every conversation. They adjusted their behavior, hoping it would bring things back into alignment. But underneath all of that, there was a quiet fear. A fear of losing the connection. A need for reassurance. And that state was being felt. Not through words, but through presence. Eventually, they stopped. Not out of frustration, but out of awareness. They realized something important. Everything they were doing was coming from uncertainty. So instead of trying to fix the situation, they shifted their focus inward. They stopped asking, "What should I do?" and started asking, "What am I accepting as true right now?" And the answer was clear. They were accepting instability. They were expecting inconsistency. So they made a quiet decision. Not to force anything externally, but to settle something internally. They began to move from a different place. Not trying to hold on, but feeling as if the connection was already secure. Not hoping things would improve, but acting from the assumption that they already had. And something changed. Not instantly. Not dramatically. But steadily. The communication became more natural. The tension disappeared. The connection started to feel easy again. Not because they controlled the other person, but because they were no longer projecting uncertainty into the dynamic. That internal shift created space for something different to happen. Now consider another example. Someone struggling financially. Working hard. Doing everything they were supposed to do. But always feeling like they were behind. No matter how much they earned. It never felt like enough. So naturally, they focused on money constantly. They planned. They worried. They tried to stay positive. But underneath all of that, there was pressure. A constant awareness of lack. And that awareness shaped every decision. Every opportunity was filtered through doubt. Every risk felt heavier than it needed to. So even when progress was made, it didn't last. Until something shifted. Not in their income. Not in their external situation. But in their internal state. They stopped identifying with the struggle. They stopped reinforcing the idea that things were not enough. And instead, they began to operate from a different assumption. That things were already stabilizing. That they were already moving into a better position. Not as a forced belief, but as a quiet certainty. And from that place, their decisions changed. They became calmer, more clear, less reactive. And that clarity led to better opportunities, better choices, better outcomes. Not because something outside suddenly appeared, but because they were finally in a state where they could recognize and receive it. Now one more example. Someone who struggled with confidence. Not in obvious ways. They could function. They could interact. But internally, there was always a sense of hesitation. A subtle feeling of not enough. So even when they tried to appear confident, it felt forced. Like they were performing, rather than being. And people could sense that. Not consciously, but energetically. So their interactions reflected it. Until they understood something simple. Confidence isn't something you act out. It's something you accept internally. So instead of trying to behave differently, they focused on what they were assuming about themselves. And they saw it clearly. They were constantly questioning their value. Constantly measuring themselves. So they stopped. Not by forcing positive thoughts, but by removing the habit of doubt. By choosing quietly, consistently, to see themselves as already enough. And over time, that became natural. Not something they had to think about. Something they simply were. And everything changed. Their posture. Their tone. Their presence. Not because they tried to fix it, but because the internal state shifted. And that's the pattern in all of these examples. Different situations. Different outcomes. But the same underlying change. Not more effort. Not more control. But a shift in what was internally accepted as true. That's what creates the difference. And once you see it, you start to recognize it everywhere. In people who seem naturally at ease. In situations that flow without force. In moments where things fall into place, without struggle. It's not random. It's not luck. It's alignment. A quiet, stable alignment between what is felt internally and what is expressed externally. And that alignment is available in any moment. Not something you have to earn. Not something you have to chase. Something you simply step into. And once you do, you begin to understand why this works. Not as an idea, but as something real. So how do you actually live this? Not as an idea. Not as something you understand for a moment, and then forget. But as something real. Something you can return to, in the middle of everyday life. Because this is where everything either changes or stays the same. It's not in what you learn. It's in what you apply. And the application of this principle is much simpler than most people expect. But it requires something different. Not more effort. Not more control. Just awareness and a quiet decision. The first step is this. Stop trying to fix the situation. That might feel uncomfortable at first. Because you've been conditioned to react. To solve. To do something immediately. But the moment you feel urgency, pause. Because urgency usually comes from uncertainty. And if you act from that state, you reinforce it. So instead of reacting externally, shift internally. Ask yourself, what am I accepting is true right now? Not what you want to be true. Not what you're trying to believe. But what actually feels real in this moment. That question alone brings clarity. Because it reveals the state you're operating from. And once you see that, you have a choice. Not to fight it. Not to suppress it. But to gently redirect it. This brings you to the second step. Choose the state you want to operate from. Not forcefully. Not with pressure. But with intention. If you're feeling uncertain, what would certainty feel like? If you're feeling lack, what would stability feel like? If you're feeling doubt, what would quiet confidence feel like? You don't need to make it perfect. You don't need to hold it all day. Just touch it. Even for a few seconds. Because those few seconds begin to shift something deeper. And that leads to the third step. Speak and think from that state. Not to create it, but because you're already in it. This is a subtle difference. But it changes everything. Instead of saying, I hope this works, you move from a place of, this is already settled. Instead of thinking, what if it doesn't happen? You naturally think, it's already moving in the right direction. Again, not as forced positivity, but as a reflection of the state you've chosen. And the more you return to that, the more natural it becomes. This is how the shift happens. Not all at once. Not perfectly. But gradually. Through small moments of awareness. And quiet redirection. Now here's where most people overcomplicate things. They think they need to maintain this state constantly. They think one moment of doubt will undo everything. But that's not how it works. What matters is not perfection. It's familiarity. The more familiar you become with certainty, the easier it is to return to it. And over time, it becomes your default. Not something you practice, something you are. And that's where the identity shift begins. Because you're no longer someone who reacts to life. You're someone who understands it. You're no longer chasing outcomes. You're aligning with them. You're no longer trying to control every detail. You're trusting the internal state. That shapes those details. And that changes how you move through everything. When uncertainty appears, you don't get pulled into it. You recognize it. And return to stability. When doubt shows up, you don't fight it. You simply don't give it authority. And when things don't immediately reflect your internal shift, you don't panic. Because you understand something deeper now. That reality follows. It doesn't lead. So instead of checking constantly, you remain steady, calm, certain, unmoved. And that steadiness is what creates consistency. Not in a forced way, but in a natural one. This is what it means to apply this in real life. Not through big, dramatic changes, but through small, consistent alignment. In conversations, in decisions, in quiet moments when no one else is watching. That's where it matters most. Because that's where your true state is revealed. And over time, those moments shape everything. They shape how you see yourself, how you see others, how you see what's possible. And eventually, you don't have to remind yourself anymore. You don't have to practice certainty. You don't have to think about alignment. Because it becomes natural, effortless, a part of who you are. And when that happens, life starts to feel different. Not because everything is perfect, but because you're no longer approaching it from instability. You're grounded, clear, certain. And from that place, things begin to respond differently. Situations feel lighter. Decisions feel easier. Outcomes feel less forced. Not because you're controlling them, but because you're no longer resisting them. And that's the shift. From force to flow. From doubt to certainty. From reacting to understanding. You're not becoming someone new. You're returning to a state that was always available to you. A state where you don't need to chase life or convince it to change. Because you already know. It responds to what you've quietly decided is true. And once you truly understand that, you don't move through life the same way again. You move with a different kind of presence. A quiet confidence. A calm authority. Not loud. Not forceful. But steady. And unmistakable. Because now, you're no longer searching for the answer. You're living from it.